Welcome. We're glad to see so many of you here who are interested in finding out more about this topic. I'm Jean Towns. I'm a member of the UU Climate Justice Committee, 350 Corvallis, and a new group that's called Act on Climate. And there'll be more information about them a little bit later. There's three other handouts on there. There's some general information about megaloads, this handout. There's some additional points here about why you should care, why we care. And then there's a sample letter to be sent to the governor, ODOT people, etc., and some addresses on the back if you will write to them and let your opinions be known. So we put this together because since mid-December there's been a lot of news coverage, which you may or may have not taken note of, about megaloads moving through eastern Oregon and on into Idaho and Montana, and lots of demonstrations trying to disrupt their passage. Here in Oregon, Native Americans from the Warm Springs and Umatilla reservations tribes, supported by people from Portland, Idaho, Spokane, Seattle, Albany, Corvallis, and probably some other places that I'm not aware of, have been demonstrating in eastern Oregon, have been arrested, trying to obstruct the passage of these pieces of machinery. And this forum is to provide information about what these megaloads are all about, why people feel it is important enough to get arrested, how these megaloads relate to the development of the tar sands in Alberta, and how they are a part of contributing to the greenhouse gases which are destroying the climate as we know it. We've also been hearing lots of publicity over the last several years about the impacts of the KXL pipeline if it gets approved. But KXL pipeline is far from Oregon. It's not in Oregon. It's not going through Oregon. However, these megaloads bring the KXL pipeline and tar sands development pipe directly to Oregon. They're now part of our Oregonians' direct contact with this stuff. The next speaker on our list is Jim Powers. He's going to give you sort of the overall picture, the background about all of this. He's been working actively to educate about the perils of climate change for humans and future generations of life on Earth. He cut his teeth in Oakland, California, writing about education inequalities there, and joined a march as a high schooler to boycott the Oakland public schools. Tim's family moved to Albany 32 years ago. He participated in Albany Christians for Peace in the 1980s and was very active in Albany against coal trains last year when there was plans that I think are not completely dead, but they're on the back burner, to run a large number of coal trains through Albany on their way to Coos Bay. He's a member of Act on Climate in 350 and is working on a lot of fronts to try to slow the emissions that are destroying our planet.
My goal is to take you through the big picture down to the little picture as to our concerns about megaloads. This is what they look like. They're gigantic. I think it's the most recent assault on the Pacific Northwest. I will be talking a little bit about all the other assaults on the Pacific Northwest. But I want to go sort of in this order. The big picture, which is climate change, tar sands, extraction in Alberta, then talk about where the Pacific Northwest stands in that, and then show you where megaloads stand in that. So we all know this is a global issue. The CO2 we put into the atmosphere doesn't stay where it's put. It's everywhere, and it's warming it. This actually shows the red is the route from Asia. Some of the megaloads before this one came from Asia up to the Columbia River, along the Columbia River, and then as you can see, this megalode ends up in Alberta. And where does the oil go? Maybe through the KXL pipeline down to the Gulf, and of course it'll be exported all over the world. This is a map of pipelines in the U.S., and when I looked at that, I thought, golly, that looks like the blood in my veins. We breathe it, we drink it, it's all over. And those of you who have studied climate change and really read into it, some of the statements that are coming out of scientists are really frightening. And rather than whitewash it, I'll just pick a few for you. One guy says, I'd be surprised if generations after me witness the extinction of humanity. We will have very few humans on the planet because of lack of habitat, possibly. Earth's climate is changing currently at 10 times the rate of any other moment in the last 65 million years. And we're seeing potential irreversible effects of melting the Arctic ice. So this isn't something that we should be messing with. We should be dealing with it really severely and rapidly. As many of you know, we hit the 400 parts per million CO2 level last year, and the reason this is important is, depending on the literature, some say that this is the highest. The last time that it was at 400 was 14 million years ago, well before humans were on the planet. There are points of no return when we have too much CO2 and we start producing a lot of methane. We get a runaway effect. There are some key numbers that many scientists have looked at that are sort of these limits. One is a 2-degree increase in Celsius of the Earth's average temperature. I hate to say it, but many scientists think 1 degree is more than we can stand, and we're already at 0.8. There's pretty good evidence that we could hit 4 to 10 degrees by 2100. I have grandchildren. They're only going to be 86 years old. My dad's 97. This is a reality potentially for my grandkids. And there's been a lot of talk about trying to keep the levels below 350, and we're already at just about 400. So I sort of thought this summed it all up for the big picture. Any human effort to increase fossil fuel extraction and combustion is the sign of a terribly crazed addict, or the indication that we don't understand the situation, or that we just don't give a damn. So that's the big picture. We cannot keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. So then we go looking at the tar sands project, which Hansen said is called game over for the climate, and we'll talk about why. These Alberta tar sands enterprise, these are some pictures. The one on the left is what some of the places look like up there that we've destroyed for oil. The picture on the right and at the bottom sort of gives you an idea of how thick this tar is. I mean, it's literally, it's like roof tar. It's really thick, and so the cost to extract it is, besides the environment that it destroys, is a lot of extra energy. This is a picture on the right of where the Alberta tar sands are. Those are in orange are the major tar sands fields in Alberta. And I've been told it's the size, roughly the size of Florida. So what do we get? Even Oregon, longer droughts, bigger storms, lower water tables, lower snowpacks. This is real. Just to give you an idea of the effect of the tar sands mining, if they could extract everything that's in those mines, I'm going to show you what the effect is. One of the limits that scientists tell us is this 1 trillion tons. And I don't expect anybody to understand what 1 trillion tons looks like. It's just a massive number. But let's just agree that, let's just assume for a minute they're right. That the most we can extract, the most carbon we can put in the atmosphere forever, past and future humanity forever, is 1 trillion tons. Without almost for sure risking going over 2 degrees. Looking at the internet yesterday, one site which runs the numbers up was at 576. So we're at almost 60% of the 1 trillion tons. The Alberta tar sands have the potential of pumping 240 billion tons. So those red boxes are the size they can produce. So if we look at the bottom half, they're virtually about a little under half of all the carbon that humans have ever pumped into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And the top is how much more we have to go for all the rest of the future. And that red box on the right shows that would be more than half of that, just itself. This is a huge project. Okay, well, what about the Pacific Northwest? So, these are the proposed projects in the Pacific Northwest on the right side for gas, oil, and coal. And that number you can't see too much up along the left side is close to 800,000 metric tons of carbon. Down on the lower, CO2. There are different numbers, but it's a big number. There's a lot of it. These are the projects they're planning. The Keystone XL pipeline is the furthest blue box to the right. So that's a huge problem, but there's a lot even bigger problems that they're trying to run through the Pacific Northwest. There's 7 coal export projects worth about 256 million metric tons per year. There are 3 oil pipeline projects worth about 288 million metric tons per year. There's 6 natural pipelines. Now this is all in the Pacific Northwest, including Alberta. Another 217 million metric tons per year, and a bunch of refineries or oil by rail projects. And I went out and looked at the social cost of carbon. The EPA produces a table at the government level, says we're going to try to calculate the harm done to the planet by carbon being emitted in the atmosphere. We're going to try to calculate it. And we're going to do this range of calculations. And if you use the high end of their range, the projects going through the Pacific Northwest over the 35 years they're slated to run would cost, in economic costs, $5.6 trillion. So that's the harm. That's the cost of the harm. So a lot of us look at that and say, we're not for this. This is not a good thing. And then finally, we get assaulted in Oregon, people in Idaho have been assaulted for 2 years on this, but we just got assaulted about a month or 2 ago. We heard about megaloads. What in the heck are megaloads? Well, it turns out that the routes are going 2 different directions. And this direction is to run the equipment on the highways of Oregon to Idaho, to Montana, to get them back to Alberta so they can process the oil that will produce the CO2 that is causing the harm. So we went out there and took some pictures, and I thought you just might like to see what they look like. 900,000 pounds, 376 feet long. I just dropped one into a stadium for the fun of it. 24 feet high, 19 feet wide. They're really big. This is the route through Umatilla on the left. First of all, up the Columbia River on barges, then through Umatilla. And some of us followed this part way, and you're going to hear a lot more about these routes later today, all the way up to Canada. Athabasca Oil Corporation is the company who is taking delivery on these. Their goal is 500,000 barrels per day for 40 years of production. And that's why we're against it, for all the above reasons. There's some of the oil fields up there. You could do your own research on it. This is us, headed up there. A bunch of us. On the 24th, we protested. They didn't move, but I can't claim that it was because of us. They just weren't ready. Leonard will be talking a little later about his experience a week later. And Kathy Sampson Cruz is the daughter of the chief of the Walla Walla, and she was arrested on December 2nd, standing in front of the load. And that's where I'm going to end. Actions have continued. More of us will talk about those. Lots of good information on the internet about it. We're really concerned, and we're glad you're here so we can share with you our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. has arrived here from Eugene. She's a member of the Warm Springs tribe and has been active in both resisting this and organizing against it. She writes articles for the Eugene Weekly. Thank you, Kayla.
Sure.
The McMurray deposits in the Hanging Stone area are predominantly what you're calling late Cretaceous type deposits. That time frame, you're in the 125 million years ago. And really at that time, the Earth was considerably warmer. So when we're looking here you can sort of see an outline of North America. This is, again, looking at 100 to 125 million years ago. You can see Greenland, you can see the Gulf of Mexico, you can see sort of the Arctic. Due to the fact that there was more water, there was this, what they call this Western Interior Seaway that was actually created. Now, it's within and on the edges of this Western Interior Seaway is really where the deposits of the McMurray Formation sort of accumulated. Here's a block diagram showing what the McMurray deposits in the Athabasca area would look like approximately 100 to 125 million years ago. So as the sands were laid down, this becomes the reservoir component, and from many miles away the oil essentially migrates up into this particular area and is deposited. Over time those channels are abandoned and we are left with the new reservoir component from which we actually drill our SAGD well pairs, heat up the bitumen that is deposited.
So this is what that
numerous kilometers
machinery
away,
does, the
and essentially
extraction
produce
equipment
that
that's
bitumen
going through
to
it,
surface.
separates the oil from the sand.
The Hanging Stone asset is comprised of several acquisitions, and so we are developing assets. Our first asset development is
They
12 years
clear cut a
development,
lot of areas.
and then we will
in,
develop in
northeastern,
2 or 3 more phases at 25 to 40.
northeastern,
per
northwestern
phase.
Alberta to
Hanging Stone as an asset to the
drill
company
these wells.
is really
It's
our
called
first
steam
flagship.
assisted gravity drainage, SAG.
I want to be proud that I say I worked on that asset. I delivered it, and I didn't just deliver the steel.
So this
I
is the
made
kind of
sure
propaganda
that
that they pitch to
the community,
Canadians.
the people, everybody involved, that it was a win. That's what's important to me.
Athabasca's oil sands resource lies under northern Alberta's boreal forest near the city of Fort McMurray. To extract the heavy oil called bitumen from the oil sands deposits, Athabasca will use steam-assisted gravity drainage, or SAGD technology. SAGD is a proven extraction method that allows access to the resource with minimal disturbance to the forest. The SAGD process uses pairs of horizontal wells, an upper injection well and a lower production well. The upper well injects steam at high pressure into the formation. Steam from the injection well heats the oil-saturated sand. Over time, the bitumen separates from the sand, begins to flow, and, with the help of gravity, drains down to the production well. The oil is then pumped to the surface, where it is collected and processed for transport to market. The SAGD extraction technique will be replicated in subsequent projects on Athabasca's land holdings.
So this is the
An
scale of it.
efficient, cost-effective approach
Just a
to
small
development
bit
of
of
a
it.
valuable resource.
From an article I
Less than
found out of
5%
Calgary, it
of
said
Athabasca's
over
surface leases will be
200
disturbed by the
uses,
SAGD
so
facilities,
200
allowing for rapid,
different
progressive
investors on
reclamation
each,
throughout the life of the projects.
over 120,000 acres. So the end destination for where those megaloads are going is part of the Hanging Stone project in Alberta, and it's one of the next phases of tar sands development. So yeah, I just wanted to show that to you just as a good visual of what that looks like up there, so that you can better understand what that equipment's being used for and why we're in opposition to it. So I'm a treaty rights holder from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Kasauyu, who was a Wasco leader in the early stages of the reservation. She was 5 at the time of treaty signing. And so our hereditary lineage, it comes from a responsibility to take care of the land and take care of our people, make sure that our resources are protected in order for our people to be healthy. And number one is water, and then all things that live off of that. And we have a certain order of foods that go with our spiritual teachings and everything. So I have a federal treaty right, which this load has crossed through our ceded boundaries. I wish I had a map. So this doesn't show the Columbia River, but it's up along here where I'm kind of moving the cursor. And so we hold main treaty right to for subsistence, fishing in particular. My tribe in particular is very big on protecting our fisheries, as are all Columbia River Treaty tribes. And so this megaload goes straight through Umatilla and Pendleton. In this area, it stagnates back and forth, but we do have ceded boundary that goes through there. And then down outside of John Day, it doesn't show Prairie City, but along this stretch here, there's a forest conservation area. And so Highway 26, this is John Day right here, goes straight through this area, which is owned by Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. It was purchased by the Bonneville Power Administration in compensation for habitat damages done by the construction of the John Day Dam on the Columbia River. And so the John Day Basin, we actually help manage for salmon conservation purposes, salmon restoration purposes. And so this forest conservation area helps protect a lot of habitat that helps, it's like symbiosis, helps the salmon stay in balance and helps them become restored when these other animals are able to flourish too. So we have 3 different properties. This is the main one for salmon, and then these red ones are the forest conservation areas. And so there's a executive order required by state to consult with tribes when there's something that could affect them, in layman's terms. And so they failed to do that. ODOT failed to do that. I had conversations with Greg Del Ponte before they issued the permit for these loads to go through. And he just kind of placated me and, said that he respected my views and everything. But about an hour later, he ended up granting the permit anyway. So it just kind of showed how much he really didn't care. So I've been having to battle this issue with whatever little bit that I have, which is a lot of media, a lot of friends, a lot of people that have their heart invested in this as much as I do. We were able to link up with some Umatilla tribal members who are also in opposition to this crossing their ceded boundaries. So there's a lot of potential there for legal resistance is what we're hoping still for. I wish that it would go faster, but in our gathering of knowledge of this issue, and especially of it crossing through NISPER's territory, it took them 2 years before they did anything legally. So we're actually, I think we're getting a good jump start on things. I think that it's important to be optimistic and not get defeated, because the size of this project and the way that they'll try to guise it through the public, like, oh, it's just one load, and then how many went through Idaho? 38 last year? And so that can potentially happen here too. They've said that it's just one load, but we can see many more coming through for the next at least 20 years, because that project that I showed you on YouTube, their scope is for at least 20 years of development. And it's not just, it's international oil. There's Chinese and Japanese oil investors that have purchased leases to those areas to extract. And so on the Columbia River, we're on two sides of it, where there's the importing of the machinery for extraction, and then the raw crude coming back through on the export end. And so it's a really important pinch point, I think. If we were able to find unity, which I'm really, really hoping that we can get some really strong legal grounds on this, because we already have those things drafted. I have a copy of the resolution that CRITFIC drafted for us and we passed last year in July. And it's very, very strong language. So our policy writers, all of that's there. It's just really, really difficult to be in the middle of issues when you're just a tribal member and you don't really represent anybody but yourself. And then even your own leadership will look at you like you don't really have much of a voice because you're not an elected official. I tried calling the attorneys that work for my tribe about this issue. And they said that I would have to talk to my council, and that council would have to prompt them to do any research on it. So those are the kinds of things that I'm up against, because I don't represent anyone but myself. And so it's hard for me to not feel defeated in this, and I'm sure that people up in Canada feel just the same way, because they're on the face of the extraction end of it. They get to see, the majority of their water getting poisoned and not being able to hunt or fish off the land anymore. So I don't really know what the future is going to look like or what the plan is. It's hard to even think of what a strategy could be at this point. And so what our teachers, like my spiritual teachers, my elders tell me is, give it to God. That's what they always say, give it to God, pray about it. So I think that that's probably the best advice that I could give is, keep that passion going in your heart, keep praying for good things, because we're holding on to the last bits that we have left. And it's really, really scary times.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you for looking all the way up.
Thank you.
The next speaker is going to be Trish Weber. She's a native of Montana who currently lives in Corvallis. She's the co-founder of the Missoula-based All Against the Hall, a coalition of individuals and organizations devoted to fighting the creation of a permanent high and wide tar sands equipment corridor through the Pacific Northwest region. Formed in 2010, All Against the Hall has been involved in successfully defeating proposals for megaload transport projects in both Montana and Idaho. And Trish will tell you a little bit about some of the tribal involvement with that, and also about what the legal strategies were that they were able to shut it down, at least on that one route.
My name is Trish. I'm a tar sands activist. I have been since 2010. It's my confession, as it were. Just a quick show of hands here. How many folks, for my own edification, heard about Neil Young's recent Honor the Treaties tour through Canada? Oh, very good. Okay, show of hands. How many people have heard of Neil Young? I wanted to start with this slide because, number one, it's very timely. He did his Honor the Treaties tour, 4-city tour through Canada that ended last weekend in Calgary. And it was to draw attention to the treaty violations that are inherent in development of the tar sands in Alberta. All of the proceeds of the tour were given directly to fund the legal team for the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, or ACFN as I'll call them over and over and over again. And this is Chief Alan Adam, who is the leader of ACFN, and a beautiful quote by Neil Young as to why we're all doing what we're doing. It's certainly timely, and it also, I think, it really sets a nice background for a very good way to frame this issue, which is in the form of an alliance. Neil Young has really done, I think, a very nice job of demonstrating how we as white settler people can be allies to the Indigenous people who are at the front lines of this fight, and who also are in many ways in the best position, have the strongest legal status in terms of being able to put a severe brakes, if not halt entirely. So then I hit the, excellent. Okay, so top picture there, that's what the open pit mining looks like, and it's similar to what the slide that Jim showed you. Down below, this is another view of the in situ mining, or the SAG-D, and it's really, I love that Kayla did this because she did a nice the informational videos on SAG-D. They purposely showed all of those aerial shots of the forest, right? Because they want to make sure everybody realizes that it doesn't look like what it looks like in the upper slide. We're not strip mining. But what you really kind of don't see, and what the snow highlights, is the network of above ground pipes, okay? So it leaves the forest kind of intact, but not really. So First Nations that live in Alberta are challenging the tar sands based on their treaty rights. The two really major lawsuits to pay attention to. One is the ACFN, which is the First Nation that Neil Young was doing benefit for. The ACFN, they actually live downstream of the tar sands themselves. They do not, where they live, there is no tar sands. They're downstream, which is north. The Athabasca River flows north out of the tar sands region into the Arctic Ocean. And they're subsistence people. They live very close to the Arctic Circle. The water is poisoned. The animals are poisoned. Their small community of 1,200 people is experiencing phenomenal rates of death by a very rare form of bile duct cancer. Now they can't eat the food, they can't eat the plants, they can't, so they have to have all their food brought in from the outside, which means it's extremely expensive, and so now they're seeing all kinds of problems with diabetes and heart disease and everything that comes with a high sugar, high fat processed diet. So they are suing at this point to stop Royal Dutch Shell from expanding their Jack Pine mine, and that's a very crucial lawsuit as it's working its way through the courts. And the ACFN, they're dying up there. I mean, it's genocide, is what it is, and nobody really knows about it. I mean, that's kind of the other side to the climate change issue. Is not only are they poisoning our air that we're all breathing, but they're directly poisoning the people that live there. A second lawsuit that's going on, which is very important, and that is the Beaver Lake Cree First Nation. abbreviated it as BLCFN. They're suing the province of Alberta and the Canadian federal government for infringements of their treaty rights for permitting this SAGD mining, okay? Now, they're not dealing with big problems with poisoned water. I have to clarify that. The problem with the in situ, they make it look all nice and clean, but as I said, this is a network of above ground pipes, which, as any biologist will tell you, is going to wreak havoc on the habitat for the wild animals. So again, we have subsistence hunters who have seen an 80% decrease in the caribou herds in their region. They have a treaty right that says they have the right to hunt and fish on this land in perpetuity. Their lawsuit contends that the destruction of habitat is in and of itself a treaty violation because they can't hunt and fish if there are no animals there to hunt and fish. Why this is so crucial is that it has been approved by the Supreme Court to go to trial. And it's going to take a few years, it's going to be really expensive. There are 17,000 infringements because there are 17,000 permits that have been issued on BLCFN land. And a judge ruled that the cumulative effect could be considered. It was a huge, huge, huge victory for the First Nations in their treaty rights battles. So, in addition, in Alberta alone, 17 other First Nations are going to court to challenge tar sands development. Okay. So pulling this into kind of the big picture of the work that Kayla's doing as being a plaintiff in this lawsuit, and also Chief Carl Sampson of the Walla Walla tribe. One thing that's really, I think, not apparent in all of the conversations around tar sands, climate change, Keystone XL, and so forth, is the web of connection that is being formed between tribes and First Nations in North America. You can see up in Alberta, there's the First Nations, or the tar sands themselves, where there are 17 First Nations, but they are joined by all of these groups in areas that are written in red that are fighting pipelines. We've got the tribes that are fighting the pipeline Keystone from the Lakota to the Ponca. There's, in British Columbia, there's the Haisla to the Squamish. 48 First Nations in British Columbia have banded together and said they will not allow pipelines to go across their land. They are joined by the Lummi and the Quinault in Washington State. And there's also organizing now that's going on east on the Energy East pipeline. The Micmac in New Brunswick. I don't know how many people have you heard about the armed resistance that the Micmac it was really ugly, the Micmac versus the Mounties. They opened tear gas and rubber bullets, and Mountie cars got burned, and it turned violent in a really bad way. Well, the Micmac are fighting against fracking on their land, okay? But you think, well, natural gas, that's not tar sands, but tar sands is such an energy-intensive process that the natural gas that is to be fracked from the Micmac land is going to the tar sands. And then in blue, we have the megalodes in the northwest. So we have our friends with the Warm Springs and Walla Walla tribe are now joining the Kootenai, the Salish, the Bannock, the Shoshone, the Coeur d'Alene, and the Nez Perce. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the Nez Perce in a bit. All right? So the tar sands is an issue for Indigenous people that is pulling them together and unite in opposition in a way that no other issue has in the history of colonialism. They have strong treaties, right? They have sovereignty, they have a stronger legal standing, they have a stronger political standing. A lot of them do lack resources, though, and that's what's tough. Okay. So, moving on to what she said I was going to talk about, which is how we actually successfully stopped megalodes in the past. I realize that's a bit of a non sequitur, but it all does tie together, I promise. 2010, the Curl Module Transport Project was proposed by ExxonMobil. They wanted to run 186 megalodes from Lewiston, Idaho, up Highway 12. I don't know how many folks are familiar with Idaho and Montana geography, but Highway 12 goes up the Lochsaw River, over Lolo Pass, through Missoula, and then it goes up the Blackfoot River over the Continental Divide. I mean, it was just crazy. So when this was like the first major megaload project that anybody proposed. And the thing that we found out about it when we decided we're going to try to stop it is jurisdiction for megaloads, jurisdiction for these permits lies with the state. There's very little that federal lawmakers can do. So you have to work within the states to the greatest extent possible. Unfortunately, in Montana and Idaho, the governors of those states were working with big oil directly in secret meetings to develop this plan. So we were kind of, it was very challenging to find angles that we could actually use to get at them. One thing that was really important that made it possible for us to challenge them in Montana is, as you know, I think Jim probably talked about the dimensions. These things are 2 lanes wide. So that means they block highways. They have to close highways when these things go down the road because they're two lanes wide. And states have rules about how long you can block traffic. And it ranges, it's usually like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so forth. So they had this plan where they were going to build turnouts on the highway. This big truck would go and pull over, let the traffic go through, then it would go through again, let the traffic go through, and it would be kind of a leapfrog effect. And that's how they would get around the traffic delay rule. Well, nobody wanted to do an environmental impact statement on any of this. And the way they avoided doing that, number one was federal law would have required an environmental impact statement if it were considered an interstate project. So they said, this isn't an interstate project, it involves 2 states. It's the state of Montana and the state of Idaho. And it was really, actually, it was very hard to legally challenge that. And the other way they avoided an environmental impact statement was they allowed, it was set up that ExxonMobil would pay for the construction, so no taxpayer dollars were going to be used. Now that brought up a whole can of worms about the prospect of, are we going to start privatizing our road system and start letting corporations build them the way they want to just so they can use them to their own ends. Okay, so since we had 2 states, 2 different sets of rules, 2 different agencies, we had to develop 2 different legal strategies. In Montana, we challenged the KMTP over on the basis of a state law that existed in Montana called the Montana Environmental Protection Act. Again, if there are any biologists in the room, I'm sure you know about the National Environmental Protection Act. Well, MEPA is like a miniature state-level version of that. So MEPA requires for any construction project that an environmental assessment be performed. And if the environmental assessment said it was necessary, then an environmental impact statement would be done. So the state of Montana hired a consultant that was a subsidiary of ExxonMobil to perform the environmental impact statement, environmental assessment, I'm sorry. And surprise, surprise, they found that there would be no significant impact on the environment. So we filed a lawsuit. There was a number of nonprofit organizations, plus the Missoula County, challenged the validity of the environmental assessment. The Confederated Kootenai and Salish tribes did not join in the lawsuit, but they filed what's called an amicus briefing, which is a friend of the court, and that was tremendously influential. So we won that lawsuit, and that was that. They weren't allowed to construct their turnouts. ExxonMobil withdrew their application. They had to tear their megaloads apart and haul them on the freeway, and the delays to the project cost $3 billion.
Was that enough to keep ExxonMobil from wanting to do that anymore?
Yeah, they haven't. ExxonMobil has not come back.
Good.
Yeah. So in Idaho, there was no Idaho equivalent of the MEPA law. So the attorneys in Idaho had to find a different strategy. It so happened this Highway 12 passed through Clearwater National Forest and the Nez Perce Reservation. The Highway 12, as it went through the Clearwater National Forest, was on a wild and scenic corridor, okay? And if anybody's ever driven that highway, it is wild and scenic. So the land that the highway was on was actually through the Clearwater National Forest, which is a big chunk of the route through Idaho, was on Forest Service land that had been granted to the state of Idaho as part of an easement for them to run their highway on. The easement language stated that the Forest Service had a right and a responsibility to maintain the wild and scenic nature of the corridor. So Idaho Rivers United, a small grassroots nonprofit in Idaho, filed a lawsuit against the Forest Service. Okay, so this was taking it to the federal level. I went to Washington D.C. and met with a whole slew of decision makers, and every one of them said, "We've heard of this project. We really don't like it. Jurisdiction is the state. Is with the states. We cannot help you. Show us where the federal government has jurisdiction, and we'll see what we can do." So this easement by the Forest Service was where the federal government had jurisdiction. Short answer, won that lawsuit too, and U.S. District Court required that the Forest Service perform a study on protecting the wild and scenic nature of the highway and to consult with the Nez Perce tribe, because that was part of the easement as well. There's a reason that matters. Okay, this is why we're getting to why we're all here tonight. I promise. Last summer in August, General Electric barged a bunch of Megaload equipment to Salmon, and everybody watched it and said, "What are they doing? They can't go up Highway 12. Highway 12 is closed. They wouldn't dare." They did dare. They applied for a permit to move Megaload on Highway 12. In spite of this court ruling, even though the lawyers wrote to them and said, "This is going to cost you money," because, our side's lawyers. The Forest Service and Nez Perce tribe both said, no, don't go on that highway. Idaho Department of Transportation, surprise, surprise, said, "Well, not our problem. We have nothing that says we shouldn't give you a permit." They gave them a permit. The trucks moved. And the Nez Perce stood up, and they went out on the highway. There was the Nez Perce tribal leadership, blocked the highway, and got arrested. And it was a very big deal. They got all kinds of national media about it. Huge protest. Idaho Rivers United and this time the Nez Perce tribe both filed a lawsuit saying, "Hey," against the Forest Service, saying, "You got to stop these guys. It's your job." When they went to court, the Forest Service said, "We're not going to argue. We don't know if it's our job or not. We want the judge to tell us." GE sent their lawyers to argue that on the Forest Service behalf, that the Forest Service had no jurisdiction. And Judge Windmill said, like you say to a 7-year-old, "No, I meant no. No. Highway 12, so the Forest Service at that point is closed to oversized permit, period. And that's why we're here, is because Highway 12 is closed. All right, and I'm wrapping up very quickly. Different states require different tactics because the jurisdictions lies with the states. Montana, we used state law. Idaho, there was a federal easement. In Oregon, the legal approach that we're taking, and Peter will talk more about that when he talks about the lawsuit. Oregon state law requires that Megaload permits be found in the public interest, which is some language that doesn't exist in the other places where we've been working, but it's really crucial and it's what we can make to work in our favor. The common thread in all of this, though, has been and will continue to be the Indigenous treaty rights.
Could you clarify why 12 being closed in Idaho does not close the route with Oregon?
Because it's just the Route 12 in Idaho.
Route 12 is the direct route. Route 12 is the short route.
There's a long route.
The longer route is through southern Oregon, or through eastern Oregon down to southern Idaho and up over Chief Joseph Pass, not Chief Joseph, Lost Trail. So yeah, so this is, they're having to take the long route now from the Columbia River.
Thank you.
So it just closed one door, but not all of them.
Thank you, Trish. She refers to, you're at the tail end, one of the other added speakers is we have a lawsuit here in Oregon that we are pursuing, and our last speaker will tell you about that. The next speaker is Leonard Higgins. You've seen his picture already. He was one of the people who had locked down to the Megaload the first night then when they were thinking they were going to move it, and they didn't. Leonard describes himself as an unlikely activist. He began awakening to the urgent need for change in our world and a sense of personal responsibility at Joanna Macy's Work That Reconnects workshops in 2007 and 2008. And this is a side comment. Joanna Macy is going to be appearing by, unfortunately she's elderly, she doesn't want to travel much in the winter, so she's going to be appearing by Skype at the Transformation Without Apocalypse event that Spring Creek is putting on February 14th and 15th. Back to Leonard. He began looking for his place in the activist community after retiring in 2011. He's thankful for the strong social and climate justice communities and friendships in Oregon, particularly in Corvallis, Portland, and his hometown, Eugene. He's a member of 350 Corvallis, the UU Climate Justice Steering Committee, and the Sierra Club Environmental Action Team. He credits the influences of Joanna Macy and Bill McKibben for moving him to take action, including civil disobedience, to draw attention to the urgent threat of the climate crisis. And Leonard will tell you about his experiences being locked to that truck.
So the question is, why would anyone lock themselves to a vehicle of this size? And actually, I'm going to get some help telling you why someone would do that. We've been talking about the Intigenous, the Native peoples, and the chief of the Walla Walla tribe's daughter was there that same night. And I want to play an interview that was done with her, and she says it very well.
I'm a member of the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Cayuse, the Umatilla, and my tribe, the Walla Walla. Its true name is Olulapum. This river is Nichiwanapum, this whole river, clear up to our homelands. This is where we used to live. Stone's Throw Away was where we were raised as children. This is our homeland. My tribal enrollment number is X603. I'm a grandma and great-grandma, and I stand here this evening with all our brothers and sisters in our family to protect the sacred land in these waterways. It's insanity. It's insanity. Our world has become insane with the greed and the constant reverence for money and things. And I stand here as one of the gifted ones who was able to go to college and make a living for myself and my family and my husband, and all of our children, our tribe prospers from things. But this has gone too far. This has gone too far. Our children are going to die from this. And if we don't stop it now, it's going to be on our shoulders. Because they're going to say, where were you? Where was our tribe? And we have to stop it now. And we have to carry this message forward. Sisters, brothers, grandfathers, our grandchildren will listen to these stories when we're gone. And they'll say, we were here with all you folks. And we're proud of you.
My friend Scott, I've got it turned up pretty loud, chose a much more dangerous place to lock to the load than I did. He's sitting underneath the axle in between the front tires of this huge truck, And I've got another picture of him that shows what that looks like. But I wanted you to see the size of the tire and the little bit you could see of him. One of the things that happened on this night, I was locked next to him, which you'll see in a minute. They started up the truck, and I had no idea that they had already talked to Scott, and they were just going to turn the tires so they could see better how he was locked to the load. I thought they were going to move it, and it was very frightening. So that's the two of us then. Here I am, not in very good focus, and Scott is right here. I'm locked to a ladder and part of the undercarriage of the truck, and part of the undercarriage of the truck. And so Scott and I spent almost 24 hours in Pendleton in the Umatilla County Jail. We didn't know that we'd been successful in delaying the load until we were released, and Karen and Peter, Karen's in this audience, picked us up from the jail, and we were very pleased that we had that effect.
I'm a member of the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla.
So one of the things I wanted to check with you, as is the case so often, there's way more to talk about, not much time to talk. And so I'd like you to raise hands to let me know which of these three areas you're most interested in. And I'll spend a little more time on the ones that people are more interested in. So the first is the details, the technical details about what a lockbox is and what kind of practice I had to do to use it, how the law enforcement folks were able to defeat it and break us loose and that kind of thing. The second is more philosophical and moral. You know, what brought me to a place where I thought that this was the right thing to do. And then the third is the legal side of it, the arrest, the booking, jail, court, and sentencing, that kind of thing. And so, how many are most interested in number one? And how many in number two? More interest, probably 3 times more interest in number two. And then how about number 3, the legal side? Okay, so more interest in 3 than 2. So 2 than 3, yes. And so I'll speed through some of the slides accordingly. So I wanted to say a little bit more about my background. Like Jean said, I'm a pretty unlikely activist. I spent most of my life in what Joanna Macy calls business as usual. And you know, I was pursuing the American dream. I worked for the state. I very much was a part of the system. Pretty unlikely. And on top of that, I was very interested in science and technology. I still remember my weekly readers. I don't know if you guys remember those from elementary school. But I pictured that by this time we could take pills instead of having to eat food. We'd be driving jet vehicles around, and just like the Jetsons. And for a brief time in the 70s, I pictured myself as interested in social justice and and really, it was a matter of thinking I was cool. But actually, I was the oldest of 3 boys, and it'd be fair to call us nerds. So fast forward after, and it actually does seem like fast forward. Those of you my age probably know how quickly, looking back, that time goes. And so I was close to retirement. A friend invited me to a Joanna Macy workshop. I'd never even heard of her. And so at that workshop, I got a completely different perspective on things. Those times when I had concern about decisions that the government was making and the things that corporations were doing, I was not inclined to act. I didn't really think that whatever I would do could have very much impact. And on top of that, part of what Joanna Macy does is she helps people get in touch with their sorrow, their depression, their grief about the way things are. It's a very, makes me choke up just thinking about it. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's one of the things that tempts us not to take action. It's so much easier to just deny the problem and ignore it and to get in touch with the bad things that are happening.
Or to say it's overwhelming and we can't do anything about it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's me and this wonderful group of men. Here's Joanna, and her husband Fran was still alive at that time. These folks are like 40, 50-year wonderful activists. They started out in the 60s around nuclear issues. I have a lot of respect for Joanna. And I'm still in touch with many of these guys, good friends. So Joanna and a friend of hers, Chris Johnston, wrote a book just recently. And what they did is take the 20 or 30 years of work that Joanna had put into what's called the work that reconnects, and they put it in the context of what's going on right now. And the way the book starts out, it lists 3 different stories that we can tell about what's happening in our world, all of them equally true. There's business as usual, there's the great unraveling, and there's the great turning. And so the first one is what most of the major fossil fuel companies would like to do. They'd like to monetize all of those reserves and just run us right off the cliff into extinction. The great unraveling is, I think the way that I look at it is kind of like he was describing it. It's just a look at things that everything's going to hell in a handbasket. We can't do anything about it, and we'll just sit back and watch the world unravel. The third is, of course, the one that I've chosen, and that one talks about transition from where we are, which is industrial growth, to life-sustaining society. And that's a big jump. There's nothing very life-sustaining about the way that the economy of our world and the practices of our corporations, it doesn't support life. And so I'll kind of speed through these and take questions at the end. One of the things that is described in Active Hope is that there's more than one way to get involved and more than one way to make a difference. And so that's divided up into 3 areas. The first is holding actions, which are very much these protests to try to slow down the destruction of life. Another is a shift in consciousness. People that are, rather than focusing on their state or their nation, they're focusing on a community that's global. And those things that, they may not have the flashiness of some ways of making a difference. But I firmly believe that people that are doing spiritual work, that are really demonstrating and living the way that we can be in support of each other in community, that has a ripple effect. I think it is very powerful. And then the third one is life-sustaining practices. For instance, one of the folks in our community, Rob Dietz, has written a book called Enough is Enough, and it talks about a different way of organizing in the economic side of things. So this was real helpful to me. I think it helps folks that aren't led perhaps to do demonstration kind of things to know that what they're called to do is important, that it all works together. So in terms of dealing with that despair and grief for the world that I was talking about, Joanna uses what she calls a spiral. She talks about coming from gratitude. There's so much to be thankful for, just being alive. And it's a very powerful practice to focus on all the things that we have to be thankful for. It's very energizing. And so that's where she starts the exercise and the workshops. The second, after getting the energy that comes from coming from gratitude, is starting to dive into the pain that we have for what's happening in the world. And there's a number of really amazing techniques that she uses. One of them that comes to mind is she takes the group and divides it into pairs of two people. And one of them is an ancestor, someone from our time period, and another is from a future generation, perhaps 2 or 3 generations in the future. And the person that is in our time period describes to that future person what it's like being here now and what they decided to do to try to help things be better rather than worse in the future. And anyway, there's a number of different strategies there. The third part of this spiral is seeing with new eyes. And in that part, it's a visioning exercise. It's looking at what's wrong with the world and looking at what we can do differently. It's more strategic. And then finally, the going forth in these 3 areas of action that I talked about. I really didn't do justice to the spiral. I'm going to play part of an interview with Joanna. She just has so much heart in this work. So I wanted to make sure and remember and say that these are not vows that are taken like as part of a religion or like a nun or something like that. In fact, these are vows that Joanna made herself as part of her commitment to the Great Turning, and she kind of reluctantly shared them. And it's a matter of personal choice whether these fit someone's calling, but for me they really resonated. And I want to play some of an interview with Joanna. They took turns reading the vows.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to read them?
I got them right here, and unless you want to read them.
We'll take turns.
Okay, you can chant.
Okay, the first one I just love because it's so obvious, and the more obvious it is, the more I need to be reminded. And that first one is, I commit myself this day to the healing of my world and the welfare of all beings.
Yeah, perfect. And to live on Earth more lightly and less violently in the food, products, and energy I consume.
Yeah, what a good reminder. And now here's the third vow, which is my favorite. I promise to draw strength and guidance from the living Earth, from the ancestors and the future generations and our brothers and sisters of all species.
No, makes us...
All of life, isn't it?
Yes, no, it makes us weep. And your reading is beautiful. To support others in our work for the world and to ask for help when I need it. Oh, it's so good.
I vow to observe a daily spiritual practice that clarifies my mind and strengthens my heart and supports me in observing these vows.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of cap why. I want to take a quote from McKibben that pointed out why it should be me, at least in terms of generations, rather than someone else. And what he says is, your most important job is to be a citizen. That might include getting arrested for nonviolent protests, something people older in life might do more easily than those who are still young and trying to hold on to jobs. And so when it came the night before the lockdown, and they were asking who would be willing to do this went through my mind. And my hand didn't go up right away, but it did go up. And I was looking for something more direct to do, not a symbolic action, but something that really felt like it was getting in front of what I was trying to stop. And so that's why this was something that looked like the right thing for me. This is the lockbox, this device right here, and what I did was practice very quickly getting locked into the device because we only had a few minutes while the security and the law enforcement were distracted to get into place and lock to the load. And this is the shot from up above then, looking at Scott. You know, you can see the leaf springs of this huge truck, and here's the axle here, and he's locked around, just like I'm locked around this part, he's actually locked around that axle. So they decided to start with me because I was more accessible, and it took them 2 hours to defeat the device. And using what they learned in that process, they were able to break through the second one very quickly. So it's my first time. I got to experience being arrested, booked, put on the orange jumpsuit, had matching plastic orange sandals. It's quite different. Spent the night in jail, had a couple meals there. It was enough to see that it's not a trivial thing to have your liberty taken away. And I have so much respect for people like Tim DeChristopher, another person that's going to be at the Transformation Without Apocalypse coming up in February. He was in federal prison for 2 years. So this was my mugshot. Humorously, my niece was the one that sent it to me. She found it on the internet. Was interested to see her uncle, but. And this is my sentence. Really, the part that's the very worst is the probation. Since I was released on my own recognizance, if I wanted to get out of jail, I had to agree not to go to the port of Umatilla and not to go near any Omega Morgan facility or work. And that's being extended into my probation. And if I violate that, I'm threatened with having the 90 days of jail, which, did I put that on there?
30 days.
Okay, so it's a 90-day jail sentence. I put that up there wrong. That could be reinstated if I don't meet the terms of my probation. Finally, just to finish up with a couple of quotes. First one, timely, for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. and Bill McKibben, this protest is for normal people. The radicals are the oil and other fossil fuel companies. Radical is getting up in the morning to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. That's a radical idea.
Thank you. I lied to you. We've run over considerably. If you have tolerance for any more, Peter Goodman, who's one of the plaintiffs on the lawsuit that we have set in motion, can give you a very short, very concise summary of what that is and where it's at and what we're hoping will go forward from here. And then, before I hand it over, I'm pointing out to you this flyer about a forum that's coming up March 7th about all the fossil fuel export plans there are through the Pacific Northwest. And at the very end, I will draw lots for the 10 copies of this book that we have. And here's Peter. Peter is Peter's an activist from Albany Against Coal Trains, and he didn't want me to say this, but I looked him up on the internet. And Peter has experience with lawsuits, and he successfully dealt with a glass factory in upstate New York and got things changed there. So he knows how to do this.
Hello. Hello. Is it on? Okay. Hello, everybody. The biography is short because it's really not about me. It's about us. It's about what we're going to do about what we heard tonight. That's really what it's all about. We're all writing our biography for the future. So I want to talk a little bit about our legal thing. The time is late, and it's late in more than one way. You know, when you go to these things, you listen to all these facts, and they just, you know, they kind of, I think Kathy, a friend of mine, Kathy Sampson, said it best. This is insanity. This is craziness. It's just unbelievable, and our lawsuit actually addresses that. A group of us decided that we wanted to attempt to make a difference in terms of these megaloads. We knew that there had been successful lawsuits that Trish talked about. And so we commissioned public interest attorney, Pam Hardy, who lives in Bend. We spent $2,500 for her to find a way, a ledge, something we could claw up on. And she found some legal angles that might work. Now, when you see these loads, they are huge, and you stand in front of them, you lock yourself to them, as Leonard did, and you realize what a massive, massive thing this is. And what we had, really, from the legal point of view, is a pile of pebbles. We decided to throw those pebbles anyway, because you never know. You never know. And the courage of Leonard and Kathy and others, or 15 other arrests down the road a little ways, we wanted to challenge this in court. And the little leverage that we got was the fact that when there's these oversized loads, there is a provision in the regulations and the laws that says they have to consider the public interest. We don't think they did at all. What we're doing now is a procedural matter, and it is late, so I won't go into all that, but essentially we're trying to get standing, number one, as members of the public. Myself and Chief Carl Sampson have represented ourselves, both from the tribal point of view and us, the rest of the public. And that was denied by ODOT. So now we have to wait on the load being moved, because it might seem that we could, ask for an injunction, but if we do, there's a bond, and it might mean, in fact, that we would be liable, myself personally, our group, Act on Climate, for millions of dollars. Now think about it for a second. They don't have to put up a bond for this insane project, but we as activists have to put up a bond. We couldn't do that. We couldn't risk that liability, so we have to wait until they actually grant the third permit. The first two megaloads have already gone. This is challenging the third load, which is still in Umatilla. And we have to wait until the permit is granted. Then we go into court and we ask to have standing. That may very well be denied, and we challenge that. And what we're doing procedurally is we're saying, hey, ODOT, you did not consider the public interest. And the judge will rule on that. This is setting up a later substantive challenge as to why it isn't in the public interest. You would be surprised to know, maybe you wouldn't, that because all of you believe that the laws have been eroded just like our atmosphere has been eroded, right? You see that every day. It's not working. It's working great, folks, but not for us. It's working for the people that own those loads and so on. So we're up against it. But the thing is, we can use a kind of legal jiu-jitsu, a kind of way of saying, hey, you say it has to be in the public interest, and only these large loads, not the trucks that go up and down the highway, but these oversized loads written into the language is in the public interest. That gives us something to challenge, and we're going to make the case. It may go nowhere, but the thing we're looking for is time to do what we need to do, which is mobilize the public to make them think twice about what the public interest really is. So every one of you tonight, as we go through this legal process, there's a temptation, let's just wait and see what the court rules. We can't wait. That third load probably will get through, even if we're successful, because they will start rolling when the permit's granted. They start, and so our hope is that there'll be a stop to all the other loads. That's what we're hoping for. There could be, as there was in, hundreds, yeah? Hundreds of loads. Stop it here, and the pipeline will become irrelevant. We have a huge possibility and a huge task. So our lawyer has done all these arguments and so on. We have 4 plaintiffs, 2 indigenous people, Kayla, who you met earlier, and Chief Yellowbird, Carl Sampson of the Walla Walla tribe, myself, and Bob Moore, who is a local resident around Ontario. So we're covering the bases of the various interests, but every one of you that breathes and lives are co-plaintiffs in my eyes. And so we're going to take this on. It cost us $5,000. We've raised that money to get this done. We're up against General Electric. We're up against Omega Morgan with their big trucks. And we're up against the whole culture of destroying the planet for who? For what? Over on the board over there are some contact information. And I suggest however you can get involved in this, whether it's coming to a meeting. We're having a general meeting of Act on Climate. February 22nd. Come, see how you can get involved, see what you can do. We'll try to keep people informed. There's some other, what else is up here?
The contact, the handout is on your chair.
Okay. Okay, great.
Whole page on what you can do.
What you can do is the central part. There's other little twists and turns about the legal stuff, but the thing is, there is something to be done. And all of you and all of us will do it. We've got to do it.
Eloquently put. Thank you, Peter. I don't know if I'm really allowed to say this, but I'm saying it. On the Act on Climate group, there's a way to contribute to this legal effort. There is going to be more expenses than the $5,000. So let's get everybody out of here. Thank you so much for coming and being interested in this. Share what you learned with your friends and any groups you belong to. Find some way to get involved in the fight to keep our planet livable. If you want to be on the email list for either 350 Corvallis or this Act on Climate group, when you signed in, you had an opportunity to check the underneath saying you wanted to be on this list. Act on Climate is basically a group that came together around training for civil disobedience about the pipeline, and then has moved into this Megaload stuff, and we're on our way. Now, thank you again so much for coming.
There were going to be questions.